We were a family of 8 children. I was the 4th after 3 daughters. Not a Hasidic home, but nonetheless religious. My father was a Hasid, from Trisk. He would read from the Torah in synagogue. He worked very hard in order to provide for the family. I studied at a Polish school because it was free. It didn't cost money. Education until age 14 was free by law. We studied there until the afternoon. Then we would go to Heider, as it was called. It was agreed upon that I would go away to study in a high school in a different city called Gymnasia, but that did not come to pass. War erupted in 1939, and going away to study became an irrelevant idea. During the previous years, life had become terribly difficult. All of us young people didn't believe we had a future in Poland. Our dream was to come to Eretz Israel, but that was also impossible. 90% of the youth were members of the Zionist youth movement. At first, I was a member of the Mizrahi youth movement, and later I became a member of Betar. On the 1st of September, 1939, war erupted. Our town was bombed around the 10th of September, and in accordance with the famous Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement, all of Eastern Europe, which included our area, became part of the Soviet Union. Within 3 days, the Red Army arrived. We welcomed them with open arms, believing we had been saved from Hitler. We believed things would now be better. Religion was immediately outlawed. This, for our parents, was a terrible thing. My father, for example, was offered a job in which he would be required to desecrate the Sabbath by working. He refused it. He bought himself a horse and wagon and became an independent driver. There was plenty of work because most of the Ukrainians were illiterate. I worked in a wool factory while also studying in the evenings. On the 22nd of June, 1941, at 4 a.m. before dawn, the Germans invaded Poland. Within 3 days, the Polish government crumbled and fled. We were left abandoned. Ukrainian gangs, which had been waiting for just this moment, took over the town. Then the thieving and robbery, the rapes, and the murders began. This carried on for about 1 week until representatives of the German government arrived from the nearby city of Kowal and took over. Harsh decrees were immediately implemented. All males 14 years of age and older were required to immediately begin working on behalf of the Germans. This work included cleaning the streets, building barracks, cleaning huts, and loading and unloading trains. Tisha B'Av, 1941, approximately 2 months after the beginning of the war, a German unit arrived at our town and arrested 20 Jews. 8 of them were taken to the local cemetery and murdered. This was the first such occurrence. Exactly 3 weeks afterwards, it was a Friday, I took our cow out to the field, maybe 3 or 4 kilometers away. Around 9 a.m., my father came to find me and told me that more German soldiers had arrived in the city. He had been in the synagogue, and my sister had run and warned him to get away from there. Later that day, more rumors began to spread about how the Germans had come to arrest the men of our town. They weren't harming the women or the children, they were only looking for the men. In the afternoon, 3 Ukrainian soldiers arrived. They took us away, beat us, and brought us here. While they were beating us, one of them asked how old I was, and my father answered that I was 14. As it turns out, the law said that they must only take males from the age of 15, so they beat me some more and told me to get away from there. I spent the night in the field. In the afternoon of the following day, I heard that it was safe to return to town, that the Germans had left. They had taken about 100 Jews with them. They took them to a grove outside of town and murdered them there. This was the first mass murder, about 100 men.
גדל ויתקדש שמי רבה. וכל מאוד יברך ירוסי וימליך מלכוסי, יצמח פורקוני וקרב משיחי. וחיי חוינו וימי חוינו חיי דכל בית ישראל. בגלה וזמן קרב ימרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מבורך לעולם ולעולמי. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי דקודשה בריחו לעילה מכל ברכתה ושירתה טובחתה ונחמתה דמירן ועלמה ואמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה משמיה חיים עלינו וכל ישראל ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו הוא יעשה שלום עלינו וכל ישראל ואמרו אמן. יהי זכרו ברוך.
My father was murdered on the first day of the Jewish month of Elul. I was very close to him. I was his only son except 5 daughters. Everyone at home was devastated. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I too fell asleep, and I dreamed a dream. And in my dream, I met my father. And I asked him, "Father, how are you?" He was dressed nicely, with good shoes. He answered me, "I am in a world where there is only good, and I am well." And finally he said to me, and I remember this so vividly, "You and Sarah will remain alive." Sarah is my sister who survived along with me. And I always believed in this dream. No matter where I ran to, no matter where I hid, I said to myself, "My father promised me that I will survive." A while after my father's murder, our lives returned to a regular sort of routine. It was again decreed that every male from the age of 14 was required to work, and accordingly we earned our bread. We lived in terribly cramped conditions. At first my work was to build barracks for captives, about 2 kilometers outside of town. It was across from the Jewish cemetery. Later my work was to sew furs and wools. I worked at that until February or March of 1942. Our lives were pitiful. The non-Jews cooperated with the Germans in making them so. Near the end of May 1942, we were told that a ghetto was being formed and that we were to move into it. This did not prevent them from appearing at the ghetto every once in a while, bringing out a few people and shooting them. Relatively speaking, our Judenrate were good. They tried to help as much as possible. They opened a communal kitchen. Some of us stayed in nearby villages, on farms, and worked for the farmers. My sister stayed at a nearby village and worked there. On the 9th of August, which was a Sunday, we were told that the next day none of us would leave the ghetto to go to work. We were all to congregate the next morning at 8 a.m. with whatever we could carry, no more than 5 kilograms at the main entrance to the ghetto. We were told that we were all going to leave the ghetto. Obviously, that night no one slept. Everyone packed their 5 kilograms worth of belongings and assembled at the main entrance. They began to march us outside of the ghetto. The line of marching people was about 2 kilometers in length, 2,500 or 3,000 Jews. They marched us out of town, across from the Jewish cemetery, to the same place where we had built the barracks for the Russian captives. The entire area was fenced in. They brought us into this area, and we saw that alongside the fence were Ukrainian police and German soldiers, every 10 or 20 meters. We understood what was about to happen. They closed us inside the fenced-in area, and we waited. We waited until the afternoon. In the afternoon, the Gebitz Commissar arrived in his car, along with all of his entourage, and we were told to assemble, and that names were about to be called, and that these names were to receive Shen. They called our name, Biber, and we ran and took the Shen. And then we found out that only 5 of us children, the ones who worked, were to receive the Shen, and the 3 youngest children were not to receive. But we only found this out afterwards, because they called out the names one by one, and everyone who ran to take his Shen was taken out of the fenced-in area and taken into the barracks and shut up in there. About 100 people per barracks. Only then did we understand that a selection process had taken place, but we did not yet understand the enormity of horror. Around 6 p.m., they let us out of the barracks. We were almost suffocating in there, and then we saw that the entire area was empty of people, and we realized that of the 3,000 people that had left the ghetto, There remained only 600. Later we found out they had forced the ones who had been left behind in the fenced-in area to organize into groups, to undress completely, and to run to the Jewish cemetery, where mass graves had been prepared. And there they were murdered. One woman who survived later passed a note to my mother, from the oldest of the 3 younger children who had been left behind. His name was Sander, that he had written while they were still out there in the fenced-in area, that said, "Don't worry, we know we are going to God." He was barely 11 years old. They kept us there for 3 days. They had eliminated 3/4 of the ghetto's population. Then they said to us, "You're returning to the ghetto, but don't think that this is forever." Among the youth, a few groups were formed that were able to produce weapons of sorts. They decided to leave the ghetto and go into the forests. My sister Sarah was part of one of these groups. 3 such groups left the ghetto. Only one group was successful in reaching the forests. 12 weeks passed. Each one of us who remained in the ghetto had only one constant thought: how do I flee the ghetto? I prepared myself to do so. I found a pair of boots which had belonged to someone who had been murdered, and a fur coat and a knife. On the 1st of November, 1942, we saw 2 cars full of Gestapo arrive at the ghetto from Brest-Litovsk. We knew something was about to happen. There was panic in the ghetto. We did not sleep that night. The next day was Monday, the 2nd of November, 1942. We understood that there was going to be another selection. I ran and dressed quickly in the clothes I had prepared ahead of time, the fur coat and the boots. And I told the people in the ghetto, "Escape! This is the end." And people really did start fleeing the ghetto. I was all dressed and prepared to go. But that the Germans started shooting, and I said to myself, I can't get out now. I'll wait until the night. It will be dark, and I'll find a way to escape. I decided to hide in a chimney. I said to myself, I'll get in through the opening and hide there. I got into the chimney. I was there from Monday until the following Sunday. On that Sunday, during the afternoon, I heard someone walking around outside, in the ghetto. I could see that the person was wearing green pants, like the Ukrainian police did. And he walked around and around, and he opened the opening to the chimney and saw me there, and he said to me, "Don't be afraid." He was a non-Jew and a communist. He said to me, "Who are you?" I told him, "I'm Biber." He told me in which direction the other Jews had fled and said, "Later today around 3 o'clock, when the church empties, I'll bring you something to eat. In the evening, you go to where the others went." I said, "How do I get there?" He told me, "Follow the telephone lines." In the evening, it became dark. I had a knife. I had prepared it beforehand. I had it with me all the time, in my boot. I took a sack and left the town. I had to cross a river, and then I saw the telephone poles. I walked along them all night. I crossed a few villages, villages of murderers. How they didn't see me? How they didn't catch me? The dogs were barking. I'll never know. I traveled about 20 kilometers that night. I had about 12 kilometers left, but the problem was that I needed to pass a certain town called Velika Lusha, wherein there was the central Ukrainian police station. I knew I had no chance of crossing the town while following the telephone lines, and dawn was slowly breaking. And then I remembered that somewhere around there was the home of a Pole. I went to that house, to the window, and knocked on the window. A woman came to the window and said, "Who's there?" I said, "Biber." She knew my family. She opened the door for me. It was just before the dawn. I told her I only wanted to get from where I was to the village called Navir, 12 kilometers away, and that I didn't know how to get there. He made vodka legally for a living. He would only return that weekend, and she alone did not know how to help me. She hesitated for a while, and then she said to me, "All right, go up into the attic." They had 6 children in that house. The eldest son was about my age. As soon as I got up to the attic, some of the children came and covered up the entrance. They brought me food as well. After 4 days, her husband came home. He did not know how to explain to me how to get to Navir. I ended up staying there for about 3 months, until January. Then one night, a group of partisans arrived. They came there because they knew he had vodka. Among them was a Jew from my town, who was a partisan, and the woman told him that they were hiding another Jew. He asked her who it was, and when she told him, he said that my sister was a member of their group. In the morning, she came and told me that my sister was alive and among the partisans. I remained there till the end of March 1943, when the snows began to thaw. Then the Pole said he would take me to the forest I had wanted to get to, where there were Jews among the partisans. He said that the partisans had stopped murdering Jews at this point. I agreed. I arrived at the village of Nevir. I wandered around there for a month. I became a cowherder. My sister found out that I was in that village. She searched for me day and night until her group finally found me and took me to be with them. In the spring of 1943, the partisans became better organized, and the murdering of Jews truly stopped. We were 10 Jews amongst 200 non-Jews. There was a great deal of anti-Semitism amongst the partisans. We were lucky. The area we were in was swampland. The Germans did not dare to come close to it. In November of 1943, Kiev was freed, which was not far from where we were. All the time, the front was coming closer and closer, and the Germans began trying to expel us from the forests. And then we received the order to leave the forests and to cross the front, as it were. We moved east. The front moved west, and at some point we crossed it. Then began the phase of de-enlistment from the partisan, as it was called. Most of us were sent to the front. I became ill with typhus while I was still with the partisans, and I was hospitalized in a Soviet military hospital. After 2 or 3 weeks during which I was unconscious, I saw beside me a Ukrainian who had been part of our group of partisans. As soon as our fever went down, even though we could not even stand yet, we were told we had to leave the hospital and were sent to the front, with a doctor's recommendation for 10 days' rest. The Ukrainian and I left the hospital together in the direction of the train station. He said to me, "Look, we've got 10 days' rest. Why don't we go home?" I agreed. We hitchhiked, each to his own town. When I arrived in my town, it was right on the front. That was in April of 1944. Then in June, when the new assault began, the whole area was freed. 8 or 10 Jewish families returned to the town. I began working. My job was to be in charge of all the warehouses in the entire area and to transport the goods into Russia by train. While I stayed there, I did not feel good about it. My sister was in a different city, in Pinsk, and there I was, sleeping on the floor of some room I was renting, eating at the dining hall. We received vouchers for the dining hall, and constantly seeing the murders walking around. The Jewish homes standing empty, the shutters hanging. Non-Jews constantly coming into the town and trying to break into the homes of the Jews. My heart was bitter. One bright morning at the end of December, I got out of there. I went to the city of Pinsk, where my sister was. I lived in Pinsk for about a year, until the summer of 1945. Then, Polish patriotism started to come back to life. Those of us who were in western Ukraine had the right to move to Poland. At that point, I told my sister, "We've got to get out of here." In June of 1945, we got out of Ukraine and moved to Poland. My sister and I arrived in Lublin together, and I stayed there for 2 weeks. We knew we did not have anything to look for in Poland. The illegal Aliyah movement organized us, along with 20 or so other Jews. We knew a large number of the other Jews on the ships, mostly from Pinsk. We began the flight to Italy. We arrived at a city on the border called Villach, and there we waited to cross the border into Italy. Suddenly we saw a very long train enter the station. On every 3rd or 4th car, there was a Russian soldier. The train was bringing 2,000 Italian captives from Russia back to Italy. With them, we crossed the border into Italy. No one checked us on the train. When we arrived on the other side of the border, in Italy, we were transported by bus to a prisoner of war camp. We received food. The Aliyah movement began to train us. Slowly, our members grew, until we were about 200 people. On the 5th of January, trucks arrived from the Jewish Brigade. We drove all night. In the morning we disembarked and realized we had arrived back at the same place we had left. Turns out there was a technical problem on the ship. We stayed there for another day, and during the next night we were taken to the ship. The ship was later called Netzer Sereni. It was a 1,000-ton ship. 100 people were concentrated on her. I met up with my sister on the ship. Then the ship's compass stopped functioning, so we floated around in the sea for 12 days. The food was rationed, and everyone received 1 cup of water per day. No one shaved, no one showered. The stench was awful. The food was mostly rice and a few biscuits. The captain and crew were Italian. There were a few barrels of wine on the ship. At night, some of the folks would drink, and the atmosphere was lighthearted. On the 17th of January, we were discovered by the British Navy. The British immediately sent 2 of their boats that sailed right alongside of us and directed us to the Haifa port. We arrived at the Haifa port at night. Haifa impressed me enormously at the time. Also, all over the mountainside, people had built campfires to encourage us. Around 1 a.m., we were told that we were being transferred to Atlit. The British refugee camps on Cyprus didn't exist yet. At Atlit, our fate would be decided.